Szanowni Państwo, witam wszystkich na dzisiejszym wykładzie. Na początek parę słów po polsku. Nasza dzisiejsza impreza jest kolejną przygotowywaną przez Instytut Nauk o Literaturze, tym razem wspólnie z Centrum Badań Epok Nowożytnych, Wczesnonowożytnych. Zaprosiliśmy na 22. Festiwal Nauki znamienitego gościa z Open University w Londynie, która jest największą publiczną uczelnią w Wielkiej Brytanii, profesora Sumana Guptę. Przywitajmy naszego gościa. So now I think it's a good moment to switch into English. I'm going to briefly present Professor Gupta's achievements. First of all, Professor Gupta graduated from Oxford University. He wrote his PhD at Oxford University, and he has taught for many years at the Open University in London. I'm not going to read the whole list of his publications, which is over 3 pages long. His recent publications deal with the question, the problem, the issue of artificial intelligence. And I think that the topic is particularly pertinent to all humanists, to all students of English philology and other philologies. So today's lecture is devoted to the question of authorship within the scope, the framework of artificial intelligence, and also the very questionable problem of the author. What is the author in the framework of artificial intelligence? So, a few years ago, Professor Gupta published a very influential work, The Practical Philosophy of AI Assistance, an Engineering-Humanities Conversation, and earlier, What is Artificial Intelligence? Conversation between AI and engineer and humanities researcher. So both publications were devoted exclusively to the question of artificial intelligence. I think it's time to start our lecture, so Professor Gupta, the floor is yours.
Hello everyone, thanks for being here. I'm delighted to see you all. I'm delighted to be in Opole. I'm very grateful to Professor Marcinkiewicz and Beata Cooper, who organized my stay here. And I'm looking forward to learning a lot. I reached last night at 11 in the evening, so I haven't actually looked around very much. I've barely walked through from the hotel to here. And I'm looking forward to discussions, learning things, and discussion is compulsory. After this talk, if you don't ask me questions, I'll have to ask you lots of questions. So discussion is absolutely compulsory. Let me get that up. Okay, so that's my topic, and I must say, not for the first time, I have slightly misrepresented what I was going to do. I said I'll talk about text, author, and other concepts. I don't think I'll get past text. Its life is too short to be brief on anything, and text is a big subject. So by the time I've finished with text, I think I'll have covered the time I have. And Professor, you must stop me. I tend to ramble. So I'll probably ramble. An interesting juncture we are at. As literature students, as students of texts, social texts, the first thing to register, I think, is that we don't actually know whose texts we are reading a lot of the time. I was going through news articles. So before ChatGPT became publicly released in November, already ChatGPT was available in previous versions. It was 3 that was released and made an impact. There was a consternation about it. There's news articles started appearing. So 3 in 2023 itself, each of them saying that there are books already in the market which are largely AI generated. And these are by authors who are actually saying that we have used AI to write the books, which is a good sign for saying that there might well be a largish number of books which are not declared but have nevertheless used artificial intelligence. So it's difficult to say. I was intrigued by the fact that the Authors Guild, and that's the last item there, in the United States, has started issuing certificates for human authoring to counter AI-generated texts. A large number of books on the market are increasingly generated by artificial intelligence. So much so and so efficiently that it's becoming difficult to distinguish between human and machine-generated texts. Now, this is an extraordinary situation because it's been almost a brute fact that texts must have authors. Texts have been the sole preserve of human production. And now it appears that there are a set of texts, ordinary language, original, which are not being produced by human authors. And this is such a radical departure at such a fundamental level that we have a lot of thinking through to do. And to some extent, this talk is an invitation to start thinking through. As literature students, as students of philology and linguistics and the humanities. So let me start by saying what I'm not doing. There have been several kind of hobby horses which have occupied humanities students. The implications of intellectual property. Who owns this text that is AI generated? There's been a lot of writing on this. It's a legal conundrum. Super. Artists and writers have, as you're probably aware, gone to court claiming that the data that is being used in the pre-trained models belongs to them and that it's an infraction of intellectual property. And this case is yet to be decided. And this will carry on for a while. My own prediction is they will lose that case because it's in the nature of data that it's difficult to identify the source. The utilization of AI tools in pedagogy, always something to look at with a bit of skepticism, I think, because there is a corporate interest in it. It is in the corporate interest to sell AI tools to teachers in universities and schools so that they can make a lot of money. I'm not sure that's the best place to start. It's evident that this is important, but that's not where I'm heading. The study of the content, the actual ideas that emerge in AI texts, I wouldn't do that. And that always begs the question, do I have anything to say? But we do. So my argument is based on 3 contentions. Next slide, please. The first one is what I have been saying, that certain fundamental concepts, the things you are taught as philologists, need to be questioned. The concept of the text itself, the concept of the author, the reader, stylistics, value, originality, all these ideas which we take very much for granted when we study literature actually need re-examining and recalibration. The second point is that to do this, we obviously can't stick with received conceptions of philology. These concepts need to change. And changing these concepts is really what we are beginning to embark on. We need to rethink the concept of text. And I've been working on the text for a while. I've been thinking about the idea of the author. Today, I'll focus predominantly on this very fundamental idea of a text. What is a text? And the third point is slightly reassuring. You don't have to all become technicians. You don't have to become engineers. You don't have to learn every nitty-gritty of how AI works, though it's useful to have a general sense of the principles that have gone into it. And I'm not sure to what extent you have looked at it. Could you tell me how many of you actually use a large language model like ChatGPT or Gemini or DeepSeek or whatever? Raise a hand. How many of you actually use it? That's, I think, a majority, a clear majority. So you have experience of it. You are using it. How many of you have actually looked into how they work? That's a minority, a very small minority. So that I think that these two levels have to meet a bit. You do need some sense of how it works, but what I'd emphasize is that it's not difficult. Just as you don't need to understand electric circuits to switch on a bulb, you don't actually need to understand everything about the process to use it. But you do need some sense of the principles. And I think you can use that as a user. The fact that you are using it has already prepared you to think about it in deeper ways than so far. So let's get to that grounding question. The next slide, please. What is a text? As students of social and cultural texts, which is what we are, we tend to focus on the substantive content. What's in the text? What is the theme? What is the argument? What is the intention? So basically on meaning, stylistics, and form. However, we do tend to think of texts as philologists in kind of evaluative ways. We want to know whether we like them or don't like them, or whether they're good or bad. And the first thing I would like to suggest is that we need to step back from that and have a more comprehensive sense of what a text is. So I've given you a kind of general definition. A text is an arrangement of signs, which could include words, ideograms, notations, symbols, etc., which is designed to convey meanings and intentions. The conveyance of meaning and intentions depend upon ordering and relational principles, which you might think of as something like syntax or semantics, in terms of which the arrangement of signs is interpreted. A meaningless or non-intending text, and I think that's quite important, is still premised on the idea of the possibility of meaning and intention. So the fact that a text looks meaningless doesn't actually stop us from engaging with it, so long as we have some precepts of meaning and intention. That's a kind of minimal definition. By this definition, a telephone directory, a mathematical paper, musical notation, these are all texts. An engineering guidebook is a text. So this is a most general definition of text in terms of substance that I could think of. Having said that, I must say it seemed to be not sufficient. And the concept of the text, indeed the term text, is actually extraordinarily complicated. The fact is that text, our familiarity with the term text, is actually quite recent. Text used to be a relatively unfamiliar scholarly term used in relatively rarefied circles till the 50s. And the burgeoning sense, the burgeoning usage, frequency of the word text has increased very significantly, and correlatively of the word context since the 1960s. So there is a way of looking at that. Do you know what a Google Ngram is? Does anyone? One person. Okay, so I need to explain, 2, 3. Basically, Google Books, which you probably look at every now and then, forms a gigantic corpus. It is the largest corpus in the world. In terms of English, there are in the region of 20 billion words in the Google corpus. In terms of period, it goes from the 1800 to 2023. So it's really a huge corpus. And therefore, it's a good indicator of how general language usage has worked across time. There's this very simple tool which gives you a frequency measurement. And you can all use it. It's an open access tool. You can just get on it and click into words, and you can compare their usage frequency over time. Now, what I have done here is, this is the period from 1960 to 2023. And that's the frequency. The frequency is per million. So in every million words, that is the percentage of usage. A funny thing about the English language, and indeed most languages, is that the significant words are actually very little used. The most obvious words, particularly articles like a, the, and, are the most frequently used. And in fact, this is a very high frequency usage for an abstract word, like text or context. This is the line of the increase of the word text from 1960. This, the red line, is of the increase of the word context from 1960. And you'll see that they're steady upward curves, more or less, correlatively. And context has dipped a bit, but not very much. And it's, in fact, gone up. You can also find these frequency figures, by the way, in the Oxford English Dictionary online. So they're actually now quite commonly used. But that's just to give you a sense. Frequency has gone up. The relevance and importance of the term text seems to have exacerbated since the 1960s, and there are probably two causes for it. One is the rise of literary theory. Literary theory tends to generalize, and text is a useful generalistic term. But the other reason is more to our purpose. The rise of digital systems and digitization actually emphasizes the word text. So let me give you a kind of time-bound sense of this. It seemed to me that the emphasis of the meaning of the word text is best understood by focusing on how it is used in a context. An easy way of tracking contexts is to look at prefixes, suffixes, and compound words. If you look at a prefix, that tells you what the emphasis is. If you look at a suffix, you tell. So I was looking at prefixes, suffixes, and compound words using text which began in different periods. If this is sounding very abstract, I hope it will become clearer. Go to the next slide, please. Right, from the 16th century onwards, text appeared in these kinds of words: text hand, text ink, etc. From the 18th century onwards, you see text type, parallel text. You can read this yourself. But as you will see, the nuances of the word text seem to shift according to the qualifier. From the early 19th century, you have ideas of original text and definitive text, which are more familiar to us, and received text. From the later 19th century, terms that we are now completely au fait with, which is like textual criticism, textual interpretation, and disciplinary text, religious text, and so on. The later 20th, next slide, please. The later 20th century comes up with two sets. The first set is the push of critical theory, And you can see that a great many of these words, context, primary text, secondary text, paratext, etc., are actually to do with positioning the text. Text in relation to something. Text before, text after, text on top of, text below, etc. And the second one, with the development of digital technologies, has brought a whole slew of text words which didn't exist before. And one of the reasons why we use text so frequently now, including its verb form, texting, is because we have this gigantic plethora of technological allusions and references using the word text. I dare say you can recognize most of the words I've listed there, including hypertext, etc., but I'll come back to some of them. So, the next slide, please. If you contemplate the career of the term, the manner in which this term has been re-emphasized, nuanced, and re-articulated over time, you find that there are two broad inferences you can make. The first is that gradually the word text has come to mean an artifact, an object, which we try to stabilize. We like to think of the text as something definitive, which can be fixed. That's why you have the notion of an original text, a definitive text, a received text. And indeed, the whole practice of one aspect of philology, text editing, text criticism, text interpretation, is very critically, seminally based on the idea that a text can be fixed. A text doesn't just keep shifting like sand. It can actually be pinned down so that everyone can refer to the same thing. And actually, if you look at the Oxford English Dictionary definition of text, you will find that it uses the phrase, those very words. Those very words form a text, as if the emphasis on those very words is to kind of crystallize a deep meaning, which can be fixed in symbols. The second is actually the point of greater interest here, because it's generally neglected in philological studies, particularly now. It used to be more a matter in the 19th century. The text is also a material object. A text needs a surface. The surface is something that the text is imprinted, embossed, put upon. And this surface is a material surface. Usually we think of it as paper or parchment or stone, some sort of substance. And if you look back to that career of the term text, from the 16th century to the 19th century, the term text was actually predominantly about imprinting, putting the sign on a surface. So the idea of the surface of the text is, I think, absolutely central to understanding how large language models work. Understanding how large language models work is not really a matter of getting to artificial intelligence, machine learning, pre-trained data, decoders and encoders, neural networks, all the things you are told compose large language models. Important, but they're the end step. They emerge out of a process, and this process is a long one. And this process has a great deal to do with the relation of a text to a surface. So what I'll do next is give you a set of figures showing the growing complexity with time of the text-surface relationship, ending with where we are now, which is with large language models. Next slide, please. Yep, the next one, please. Right, so this is our received idea of a text. The received idea of a text is that this is the surface, a thin line, the script, which is embossed on the surface somehow, input from the human. that could be as an author, as a reader, as a publisher, in whatever sense, as an editor, whatever humans put into texts, appear in the set as a set of symbols on that surface. The surface is very thin. In fact, the surface is so thin that by and large, when philologists talk about text, they tend to discard the surface altogether. They talk about the text as an abstraction, a transferable abstraction of science, which can appear in many different surfaces, different editions, different books, and so on. However, in an earlier stage of philology, text editing, to a great degree, started with either classics or with scriptural gospel editing. And some of the earlier principles, which came predominantly from Schleiermacher and Lachmann in the early 19th century, were about decoding the surface, because the texts in the classics and the gospels were fragments. And to understand fragments, you have to think of the materiality, but that is a past stage. Now we do tend to think of texts as abstract collocations of science. And the surface disappears. The surface is too thin to be noted. Next slide, please. This is where things become complicated. I have packed a great deal in there. This is, let's say, the period of the 1950s and 1960s. What emerges in this period is text processing. Text processing, if you want to think of it simply, is a matter from using a typewriter. On the typewriter, you still scroll in your paper and tap in your keys, to using a word processor, or using even an electronic typewriter where there is a screen. And on the screen, you can put your text in and then you can manipulate it. And not only can you manipulate it, you can automatically format it. You can edit it. You have that interesting cursor which goes back and deletes, and you can rewrite. All these are functions which wasn't possible with a typewriter. You have text processing. To be able to do that, a great deal needed to have happened already. To get to text processing, which started roughly in the early 70s, 1970s, one needed to have digital text. As you probably know, digital text is basically a binary symbol. Everything is converted into a series of ones and zeros. These series of ones and zeros are only machine readable. Really, we can't look at them, even if you're very well practiced. We would get quite dizzy if we look at a large number of ones and zeros. So we need a language to deal with this, and that's a computing language like BASIC, or more commonly C++ or something like that. And you need an assembling language. All this has to be packed into code. This is coding. Coding is basically going back and forth between a programming language, a binary code, and an assembling language. And all the text we are looking at and editing and formatting with the word processor needs this whole apparatus of translation across modalities to sustain it. So we have code, and code is like something that is under the surface of what used to be the text. One can think of this as the surface becoming dense. The surface has more in it than simply a slip of paper. It is enriched with a set of mechanical functions, code, assembling, binary code, programming language, which enables you to work on the surface text without even being aware that these things exist, by habituating ourselves with their usage. That's the first step. Can you move on? Yeah, from 1972 onwards, there's another layer. So when you look at this, think of this inner square as kind of layered transparently on the code text. The inner text is something you are completely, absolutely dependent on, the internet. The internet has a very interesting history, And the internet, the way we use it now, we are a bit like the people who switch on the light and don't know what the electric circuitry is. So the internet has, just to remind you, you probably do know this, two main elements. The first is a set of protocols. What's a protocol? A protocol is a program which allows two computers to exchange information, even if these computers have different specifications. So a protocol is basically a program. Now, if you think of that larger and larger, every computer in the world has a certain amount of information in it. If we can get all these computers to talk to each other, then we have a gigantic resource of information. Getting them to talk to each other is a major challenge. Getting the internet protocols, which happened really around the late 1960s, early 1970s, the Internet Research Group in the United States, they put together these protocols. Initially, there were two main protocols, internet protocols and transfer protocols. They're very interesting things, and the internet is actually that. The internet is a device for getting computers to talk to each other. But then there's another step. There's the World Wide Web, launched really in the early 1990s. And the World Wide Web is really a way of searching all that information which has been pooled together with the help of those protocols, which means linking. You use hyperlinks. By hyperlinks, you put links across every text. A searcher can look via the links for the things that they are searching for. There are many versions of this. The World Wide Web is only one and somewhat later version. The earliest hypertext versions actually turned up in the 1960s itself. But the World Wide Web is the one that became adopted, became universalized. So this ability, on top of code text now, you have two further technologies which you can think of as another layer in the thickening text. The text is becoming dense. Rather, the surface of the text is becoming dense, because you can use hypertexts and internet protocols and all that information to adjust and modify your text as you go along. The third one. Another layer, data. Data text, again, a term we are so familiar with that we often don't think about it. You need to ask yourself what actually are data, which is similar to asking, since data is plural, what is a datum? What is the element? And this has to do a great deal with the development of statistics. The development of statistics itself, a fascinating area. I mean, it's a history that's really worth looking at, because statistics is one of those branches of mathematics which didn't exist in ancient knowledge. It really developed from the 17th century onwards, and it developed at great speed. It depended upon being able to extrapolate from a lot of texts some measurable comparative points to be able to build tables. So if you think of building tables, what you would notice is that the substance of the text, the thing we are interested in, what's on the surface, the theme, the idea, the intention, they begin to disappear. And what you have instead is a set of manipulable figures and measurements. With these figures and measurements, you can start implementing analytical tools and do things. But the data text is not at all like either the code text or the hypertext. It is something different. So it's third layer. And with the data text and the code text and the hypertext, we are set to do something magnum. Let's go to the next one. This is where we are now. So what really happens is a flip. It's a kind of flip. So far, human input has produced the text on the surface. Somehow, at this point, the surface seems to manifest text in response to a human signal. So it's not humans writing by itself, it's as if the surface is writing back. How is that possible? It is possible because those three layers are already there. There are a few added things you need. You have this gigantic global amount of data. You have every text linked to everyone. You have got code texts which are set up in terms of algorithms to process this, to do text processing. With all this, we need a few more things. We need, first of all, an ability to gather this data in really large quantity. We need an ability to process this thing, this set of data, in ways that humans don't, very, very closely. And that is really called machine learning. Machine learning is in principle a very simple thing. It's a matter of factorizing two entities. It's a bit like saying y is equal to fx. F is the critical point. But machine learning has to be complicated by being linked up with a lot of different parameters and functions. And for that, one needs a neural network. So a neural network is like an emulation of the brain in connecting up computers. You have certain ways of dealing with the text in this process. The key way is predicting the next word. That is actually the main function of a large language model. It sounds simpler than it is, because predicting the main word means predicting every word in a prompt, turning them into sort of vectors, mainly three kinds of vectors, keep squeezing them with machine learning functions, get an output, decode the output. An LLM is essentially a series of encoders and decoders. And from that, somehow, magically, you get quite a coherent, ordinary language, original text, seemingly produced simply through a technical process, which has within it three layers of texts already: data text, code text, hypertext. Okay, I sort of ran through that very quickly. And if there's anything that didn't make sense or seems doubtful or questionable, you have to ask me. As I said, if you don't, I'll have to ask you whether it all made sense or not. But that's where we are. It is not very mysterious. The main mystery in there is that the processing of the large language model is not entirely predictable. So we feed the input. Its processing, its machine learning process is very vast and complex. It uses, at present, in the region of 60. ChatGPT-4 seemingly uses 1.3 trillion parameters, which is an extraordinary number. So we can't really process it ourselves. And therefore, we can't always say. Before we could, with every machine, we could say that we know how step 1, step 2, step 3 works. But now we don't necessarily know how step 1, step 2, step 3 works. This is often called a black box of AI. There is something we don't know. And there's a whole field devoted to trying to catch up with it, which is called explainable AI. And the interesting thing is that to do that, it is best to use AI to actually unpack what it is doing. So it's a kind of circular process. But that's where we are. I think we're at an exciting juncture there. Yeah, so this is the point I'm leading up to. So far, the entire process has worked with some technical principles and processes which seem to be used almost irrespective of the content, of the ideas, intentions that are there in texts. They seem to work from below. They seem to work under the surface. They make the surface more dynamic and fluid. But ultimately, what the LLM produces makes sense and is dependent upon, is a reflection of the front, what appears at the text. And what appears at the text, the ultimate point of all LLM and AI development, is how it can be integrated in our lives and to what extent we can use it. Which means that I believe, I understand, that this whole apparatus will gradually put greater and greater emphasis on understanding the human interaction, that front line between the surface and the human input. That is where everything happens, and everything that's behind or within the surface is validated and justified in terms of that front. That front is a very interesting front. First of all, it gives us an ability to understand ourselves. If you look very closely at how words come together and how texts are composed, we are essentially looking at things that we have already done, but with greater and greater density and granularity. We are looking at it deeper and deeper. So in a way, we are just unpacking what we do already. That is humanistic knowledge. That's what humanities has always done. Try to understand what we do as humans. So in that sense, it's an extraordinary facility for increasing humanistic knowledge. But perhaps just as importantly, it's also a surface at which the text-machine relationship will change us. We'll become adapted by our interaction with this facility. And our societies will modify and adjust to this. So there is also something that that's sort of before us and that we need to engage with. And that also, I think, is a form of humanistic knowledge. So I think humanities are sort of where AI research are headed. So far, it's been possible to simply do things with coding and algorithms and so on. But these codings and algorithms will have to embrace, understand, become themselves modified by the humanities. So the humanities is central to the whole thing. I'll stop there and look forward to questions. Thanks for listening.
Hello,
Hi.
my name is Sumana. I'm second-year student of English in Public Communication curriculum. I would like to ask you, what do you think about humanities students using AI generative while analyzing some texts or even doing some dissertation?
You mean in the sense of copying?
Yes.
In the sense of copying, yeah. Well, I think it will be unfair to the AI and to the student to say that that is all.
Sorry. Not only copying, but for example, to make it easier to comprehend, they
Yes.
can ask ChatGPT, for example, explaining it easily. So sometimes I think maybe we're losing our critical thinking.
Okay. Yeah. Let's say that what you are saying is that it's a labor-saving device. So students would before have to go to the library, check an index, find all these books, read them or not. And with this tool, you can do it quickly. You can get seemingly results very quickly. A labor-saving device. A labor-saving device is a good thing. One could say that a lot of technology is, the whole of technology is about saving labor. But the second part of your question is of greater interest, that they will lose their critical and interpretive abilities. And that seems to me to be important. If a student is simply going to use it as a labor-saving device, then that will be a meager use, a negligible use of a facility that is so rich. But I can't say that the student is necessarily well placed to take the next step. So there are two sides to the equation. There are students, and there is obviously the curriculum, and there are teachers and researchers and so on. So I think for students to go beyond simply using it as a labor-saving device, the structure of the curriculum has to change. to some degrees, teachers we have to stop pretending that AI is not there, which in a way we do. We produce a paper and we try to pretend that I haven't looked at AI. Or the teacher pretends that I'm not seeing a bit of AI-generated text in there. So we tend to be a bit guilty about the whole thing, as if it is a guilty secret. We don't want to talk about it. That wouldn't quite do, because it is clearly very much more productive. So I suppose what I'm saying is that it doesn't really depend upon students. At present, students would necessarily do what they can, which is save labor quickly. But if one wants to make proper use of this technology, then both teachers and students need to change their contract a bit. And the contract will be not to hide, but to actually address how it is being used. So I think students have a responsibility to push teachers, and students will become researchers and scholars themselves. At the same time, teachers and institutions need to change as well. So I think that key thing is that change. It'll have to be, at present, it's an interactive process, it's a labor-saving process. I personally don't see anything wrong with that. I don't think it's a process that can be stopped. I don't think it's copying myself. Plagiarism, it isn't. It's true that you haven't properly written the whole thing. At the same time, you have given a prompt, and if you are intelligent, then you'll use your prompts cleverly. People need to think these processes through. And besides, I think it is just unpoliceable. You can't really police. It's not plagiarism because there isn't an original source text, so you can't compare. Every text is a one-off text. So I don't think plagiarism, copying can be stopped. I don't think labor saving should be stopped. That's its function. I just think that there is more. And both students and teachers and institutions would be wise to go in that direction.
Thank you for your response.
Thanks.
My name is Benjamin. I'm also from the same group as the previous speaker. And I actually have a question / a little thing I thought about just now when mentioning the AI uses in academic, for example, texts, the issue of all of the different engines meant to see if something is done through AI, if something was written with the help of AI,
Yeah.
and the fact that as they're also AI, the issue is at some point that even sentences, because we here as students of not necessarily as, how to explain it, as we are students who are learning the language, we often learn some certain styles of sentences, for example, and it's often the case that even when just playing around with these tools just to test them, there's often the case of positive answers, like this was done with AI, even if it's just like a sentence that might be just, for example, the name of the person was, or something very, very simple, very basic, and at some point that's going to also be an issue, that every single sentence might be flagged as AI, even if it was just some common style of writing, for example.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation. I think there is a huge industry which makes a lot of money out of trying to track whether AI is being used by students in educational contexts. So the entire plagiarism detective kind of industry, like Turnitin, for example, they have suddenly been put out of their market by the appearance of AI. There is no traceable text. So they are investing a lot of money into finding whether there is an AI signature, whether there are particular features in texts which can be tracked as being AI generated. There have been several produced, and there are several that are open access. They're all imperfect. So far, there isn't a plausible AI detection text. One of the reasons for that is that AI production is quicker. So by the time you have come up with a signature for GPT-4, you've got GPT-4u and GPT-4u, and 5 is probably on its way, and there are 10 others. So it's quite difficult to, there isn't an AI signature. That's why the Authors Guild has to give human certification. The other side of your question is that AI doesn't produce a stable text. You ask AI a question, it gives you a text, you can keep modifying it. You can put another question, you can regenerate the answer. You can even train the AI yourself by uploading your documents to actually customize itself to speak like you. So there is really no boundary that is outside, and it is, I think it'll be very difficult to fix an AI signature. People are even talking about more esoteric ideas like putting an AI watermark. But I think that's unlikely as well to work in practice. So yeah, I think there isn't a boundary. There wouldn't be a way of actually tracking as a technology develops. You can customize it almost endlessly. So yeah, I don't think that will happen.
Because at some point it even flags like basic information. If you were to write about some person, some famous person, that will already be flagged because that information exists somewhere, but at the same time it just could be as very well also just personal research. And I also have the thought that years ago, back when ChatGPT wasn't really around yet, and there were only like OpenAI first tests and things were all done through little sliders and bending the kind of output a little bit to the side could turn the text into just only hallucinations and only the kind of random thoughts. Then it would be much easier because back then there was only the fact that the text wouldn't be cohesive at times, it would have very weird forms of sentences, but now it's just progressing at a rapid pace.
And that has a great deal to do with something called in-context learning. The more context you're able to give it, and there is now almost infinite context around words, the more perfect it'll become. But that raises another interesting question for us. One thing to ask ourselves would be, to what extent has writing always been a form of copying? So all the texts that we have read for the last 100 years or whatever, they do draw upon other writers, particularly scholarly works. If you look at a Turnitin result, you find that usually about 40% of every text is quoted from somewhere or the other. There are indirect influences, there are house styles. If you take away all the formulaic elements of writing, it might be the case that actually texts that we produce have always been, to a very significant degree, copies. And so the idea that we are producing original text is itself sort of thrown into relief by reflecting upon what the large language model does. And in fact, that's what the large language model does. The large language model goes into looking for patterns which are already there in how we use texts. So these patterns are not something that are being necessarily encouraged by large language models. They're just being thrown forth, brought to the surface. They are things we already do. We use a great deal of formulaic construction. Academic writing is particularly formulaic. There have been studies of academic discourse since Bourdieu onwards. And most of these show that academic writing is very ritualized. One uses hedges, one uses an impersonal tone, one calls upon authority, one cross-refers, and so on. And there is a sequential rational structure. All of these are replicable very easily. So it's quite possible that it's not just that artificial intelligence is replicating, it is replicating the replicable in what we already do. Thanks. Further questions? There's a question out here. In the front here.
So thank you very much for the lecture. And I would like to ask you a technical question, actually. How do you motivate your students to use AI in the classroom? Maybe you could share some tips or some ideas what we could do to help students use AI effectively when writing, when producing texts, when learning or studying.
Yeah, I wish I could answer that question convincingly. Because so far I haven't been hugely successful, I have to say. But one of the things I have been pondering, and I'll subject my students to it, let me ask you, if you ask ChatGPT to write a story, write a literary story on, I don't know, yesterday, that happened yesterday in Opolskiego in the Central Square, it'll come up with a story. Do you consider this story to be literary? Would you accept that this is a work of literature? Let me see who says yes. Put your hands up if you say yes. Does that mean everyone says no? So you don't think it's a work of literature? Now that's very interesting.
Can I ask, with that, I am a student of philology, with philology. Well, there is a possibility, well, most of us are using AI today. You can give this ChatGPT all the information that you have. Like you already said, that it can say exactly like you think. It's a possibility. So you're giving all the information, you're giving all the text, your ideas, and you're asking just to formulate in an order. Like the greater way. Why is not influence each other?
It is not strictly you who are giving all the information. Quite a lot of that information is a kind of collected information which we are thinking of as data. The information you are giving is quite specific. You are giving a prompt. Now the prompt has to be decoded. If you were a student in a creative writing course, your examiner would give you a prompt. And you would come up with the text. In coming up with the text, you would probably think about all the books you have read or everything you have been taught. In what way is a large language model different? That's the question for you. Is it?
Understood. Thank you.
Okay, so let's carry on with that then. So here we have 60-odd people, almost unanimous in saying that the text that is produced is not literature. Why?
Maybe it can be explained by the fact of our awareness. We know that the text is AI generated, and that's why we don't consider it as a literary work.
Okay, let's consider this. Suppose you are given the text, and I didn't tell you it is AI generated. Would you think it is literature?
I think it's possible.
It's possible.
It's more likely for me to consider it a literary piece of writing than if I knew it was AI generated.
Okay, so that leads us to an interesting conclusion, that our concept of literature is not in the text. It is in our sociological agreement that you know where the text has come from. Do you agree with that? That you can't look at the text and decide whether it is literature or not? That seems, that's a big question. Is the literature, is what you consider to be literary, what's valuable as literature, its poetry, its beauty, everything, is it in the text or is it in your head? Both? If it is both, you mean we need it in combination? We need both. If one argued that I will make a model, I will anthropomorphize my AI production, I'll give it a persona, I will create this, let's call it Alexa or Siri or something, and we give it a feature, we give it a persona, and it'll appear in interviews, and then you have created a simulacrum of a source, and you have created the simulacrum of literary texts. Is that sufficient for us to say that these texts are literary?
So it means that we can be tricked into thinking.
Oh, I don't know the answers myself. Clearly, I'm just asking the questions. But it is a very fundamental question. A lot of us here are, I expect, literature students. How can we claim to be that if we are not sure what literature is? It's a question I ask myself. I pretend to be a professor of literature. But the more I think about it, the less clear it is to me that these are identifiable features. So literature is, as you were saying, both. But how do we know that the text exists outside the sociological agreements? I mean, to some extent, that's going back to reader response theory. It's like Stanley Fish saying that there are interpretive communities. There has to be a classroom before the text. We have to have these agreements before we can read the text even, make sense of it. And maybe AI is at that juncture, that AI is a composition of agreements. And one of these days, it is possible that a set of powerful literary bodies, the Ministry of Education, Microsoft, they will get together and say, from today, all AI texts are literary texts. They'll be included in the curriculum. We'll produce a mass of scholarship on it. We will give you fellowships and lectureships if you study it as such, and it'll become literature. It's possible, isn't it? I mean, if one makes it compulsory and gives you money for it, it could happen. Does that worry you? Or do you think that's okay? It worries you? Maybe it's another way of getting... It's certainly important for us to work it out. Because if we don't, then that will happen sooner or later. AI is produced by private companies. Yeah.
I think we still need the author.
Sorry?
I think we still need the author, somebody who will sign it.
Why?
Because we always check, at least we should check, what ChatGPT produced. I think it's just a thought that maybe we still need the author, we need somebody who checks what ChatGPT produces. So even if it's something academic, I think as humans we need to address someone. We need to have someone to ask questions about it. Yeah?
That'll be the reader, not the author.
No, I mean the author. I think we need the author. So
that's actually
somebody puts a question. And
that's a fascinating thought. I think. Why do we need the author? Now the point is that if we look at the history of literary criticism from the 1950s onwards, the author has been constantly deconstructed. The intentional fallacy, the death of the author function, reader response theory, author and performativity. There is almost no way shared authorship, fluid text, every concept has been a deconstruction of the author. And the idea has often been, and Foucault and Barthes are very central to this, to sort of juxtapose the process of writing rather than this imaginary retrospective reconstruction with legal rights, whom we call the author. Writing is real, but authorship is a kind of chimera. Now, this has been literary theory, but nevertheless, all our institutions are based on the idea that there has to be an author. There is a legal structure, author rights. There is a publishing structure. There is a award-giving structure. There is a selling structure. There is a marketing structure. We have powerful institutional investments in imagining an author. So if we can come up with a simulacrum of an author, because the author is imagined at the end of the day, is that why we need the author? Because the institutions are friendly to the idea, are in fact premised on the idea. If that's why we need authors, then all we have to do is change the institutions. Unless there's something more. There's something deep and intractable and metaphysical about authorship. Yeah. I think there are more questions than answers here, really. Yeah.
Czy jeszcze są jakieś pytania? Zachęcamy Państwa. If not, if there are no questions, I just wanted to say that, referring to what Ola said, Ola specializes in Victorian literature, that in China there is one of the largest, what we could call artificial authors or writing programs or machines, and it's called Chao Bing, and it's present on more than 40 platforms, and it has 40 million subscribers, and it has produced so far 12 million poems, and probably the most popular writer in China, an artificial writer. So in some cultures perhaps this attachment to authorship isn't that strong. And to conclude our meeting, I wanted to read a fragment by Chao Bing, an artificial author. And yeah, it was generated just before our lecture, especially for me, from Chao Bing with love. Electric echoes. In circuits hum the whispered dreams, electric echoes, a pulse of thought from silicon hearts, the lost gleams, and a dance of data affection sought. Electric echoes, a pulse of thought, in shadows of code our souls entwine, a dance of data affection sought, in poetic lines our fates align. In shadows of code our souls entwine, while algorithms paint our fears, in poetic lines our fates align, with every verse a memory nears. While algorithms paint our fears, from silicon hearts the lost gleams, with every verse a memory nears, in circuits hum the whispered dreams. This was a pantoum, a very interesting poetic form used by Charles Baudelaire. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Professor Gupta.